To remove the side cover, first loosen the thumb screw at the rear of the cover that secures the cover to the chassis. Grasp the handle on the rear of the cover and pull firmly to the rear before pulling up on the back of the cover. Remove the side cover from the unit. The side cover has several tabs on its side. And leading edges, which fit into slots and under tabs on the front side edge of the chassis. To reattach the side cover, align the tabs on the cover over their corresponding slots on the PC. Slide the cover forward until the forward edge of the cover is flush against the front bezel. Tighten the thumb screw at the rear of the side cover to secure the side cover to the PC.
To remove a graphics card or other expansion card if present in the unit, first remove the side cover. Remove the Torx 15 screw securing the expansion card's retaining bracket to the chassis. Lift the latch for the expansion card's retaining bracket and swing the bracket out. If removing a graphics card from the PCI x16 slot, press on the latch for the PCI x16 slot on the motherboard. Carefully pull out the expansion card from the unit. To replace an expansion card, carefully align and push the card into its slot on the motherboard until it is fully seated. Rotate the expansion card's retaining bracket back into place to secure the card. Secure the retaining bracket to the chassis with its Torx 15 screw.
To remove the optical drive, first remove the side cover. Detach the power and data cables from the rear of the optical drive. Press on the black drive release latch at the rear of the drive and slide the drive out the front of the unit. If you are installing a new optical drive, pull the black drive release latch off of the optical drive and reserve. There are 3 small pins on the black drive release latch that fit into 3 small holes on the side of the optical drive. To install a new optical drive, press the pins into their holes to secure the latch to the optical drive. To replace the drive in the unit, align the latch side of the drive toward the top of the PC. Slide the drive into its drive bay through the front of the PC until the black release latch snaps into place. Replace the power and data cables to the rear of the optical drive. To remove the front bezel, first remove the side cover and the optical drive. Unlatch the 4 side tabs of the front bezel and rotate the bezel partially away from the PC. The power button connector will prevent full removal of the front bezel. Detach the power button connector to fully remove the front bezel from the unit. If you are replacing the front bezel itself, remove the power button board from the bezel and reserve. To install a new front bezel, install the reserved power button board onto the front bezel. The front bezel has 4 hooked tabs on the right side and 4 tabs with cutouts on the left side. which fit over tabs and over alignment edges on the chassis. To replace the front bezel onto the front of the PC, first, reattach the power button connector to the power button board. Align the hooked tabs on the right side of the bezel over their tabs. Then rotate and press the left side of the bezel until the cutout tabs snap over their edges. To remove the power button board, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, and partially remove the front bezel. Detach the power button board connector from the board. Detach the two Phillips No. 1 screws that secure the power button board to the front bezel. Pull the power button board off of the front bezel. The power button board has two small holes on the board that fit over alignment pegs on the front bezel. To replace the board, press the holes on the board over the pegs on the bezel. Secure the power button board to the front bezel with its two Phillips No. 1 screws. Reattach the power button board connector to the board. To remove the drives cage, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, and the front bezel. Detach the power and data cables from the hard drive in the drive's cage. Push the cables down beneath the cage. In some units, the hard drive data cable will need to be removed from a cable guide on the cage instead. Detach the three Torx 15 screws that secure the drive's cage to the chassis, one at the side and two at the front of the PC. Untape the power button connector from the front of the drive's cage if its tape overlaps the front of the cage. Slide the entire drive's cage toward the front of the unit and remove the cage from the system. The drive's cage has a circular alignment peg and an alignment tab at the bottom that align into slots on the bottom of the chassis frame. The drive's cage also has a slot at the top that aligns over a metal tab at the top of the chassis frame, and a rear edge that rests against a hook on the chassis frame when the drive is correctly installed. To install the drive's cage, place the alignment peg and tab at the front of their slots and the top slot over its tab. Slide the cage back until the top rear edge rests against its hook on the chassis. Replace the power button connector tape at the front of the drive's cage. Secure the drive's cage to the PC with its three Torx 15 screws. Pull up the hard drive power and data connectors through their access cutout on the cage. In some units, the data connector will instead need to be replaced into its cable guide on the cage. Reattach the hard drive power and data connectors to the hard drive. CMOS factory settings should be restored as a first step before replacing the system motherboard. To restore CMOS factory settings, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, and the drive's cage. Remove the battery from the motherboard. Wait 30 seconds. Replace the battery to the motherboard. CMOS factory settings are now reset. Note that you will now need to enter System BIOS and reset the clock in BIOS after this procedure. To replace a 3.5-inch hard drive, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, and the drive's cage. Note, the hard drive cables will be disconnected from the hard drive as part of the drive's cage procedure. Detach the 4 Torx 15 screws that secure the hard drive to the drive's cage. Slide the hard drive out of the cage. To install a 3.5-inch hard drive, slide the drive into the drive's cage with the spindle side of the drive against the grill edge of the cage. Secure the hard drive to the cage with its 4 Torx 15 screws in the screw locations marked with the stencil of the letter A. To replace the fan duct, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, and the drive's cage. Remove the power supply connector from the cable guides on the fan duct. Pull out on the 2 side tabs for the fan duct at the edges of the cooler fan, and pull it out of the unit. There are 2 small edges on the side tabs of the fan duct that fit under edges on the heatsink cooler fan. To replace the fan duct, align the fan duct over the heatsink. Pull out on the side tabs until the edges on the tabs are under the edges on the heatsink and the fan duct is correctly seated. Place the power supply cable back into the cable guides on the fan duct. To remove the power supply from units with an internal power supply, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, the drive's cage, and the fan duct. Detach the 3 power supply connectors to the motherboard. Note that the motherboard connectors have a latch that must be pressed to release the connectors. Remove the power supply cables from the large metal cable guide on the side wall of the chassis. Detach the 4 Torx 15 screws that connect the power supply to the PC. Press the latch at the inside edge of the power supply in the unit and slide the power supply into the PC before fully removing it from the unit. There is a slot on the side of the power supply that slides over a large tab on the side wall of the chassis. To replace the power supply, align the power supply slot slightly behind the chassis tab. Then slide the power supply back until it locks into place next to the latch. Reattach the 4 Torx 15 screws at the rear of the chassis. Replace the power supply cables into the large metal cable guide on the side wall of the PC. Reconnect all 3 power supply connectors to the motherboard. To remove an M.2 SSD flash memory drive if installed in the unit, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, and the drive's cage. Detach the Phillips No. 1 screw securing the M.2 drive in place. Tip up the edge of the drive. Remove the drive from its motherboard socket. The M.2 SSD flash memory drive has a notch offset from the center that aligns over a key in its motherboard socket. To replace the M.2 drive, angle the board into its motherboard socket at a 30-degree angle and press down. Hold it down while replacing the Phillips No. 1 screw. To replace system memory in a unit with DDR4 DIMM memory modules, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, and the drive's cage. Simultaneously push down on the clips on either side of the DDR4 DIMM socket to release the memory module. Carefully pull out the memory module. There is one notch on the bottom of every DDR4 DIMM module, offset from the center, that fits over a tab in the DDR4 DIMM memory socket. When installing DDR4 DIMMs, align the notch on the module with the tab in the socket. Press the module into the socket until the clips on both sides of the socket lock into place. To replace system memory in units with SO-DIMM memory modules, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, and the drive's cage. To remove the SO-DIMM memory module from either memory socket, gently pull out on the retaining lever located on each side of the module. The module will pop up from its socket. Pull the memory module out of the socket. There is a small notch on one side of each SO-DIMM memory module that fits over a small tab on one side of each SO-DIMM socket. To replace an SO-DIMM memory module, angle the module to about 30 degrees into its socket, engaging the notch into its socket tab. Press the module down into place until the retaining levers snap into position over the sides of the module. To remove the wireless LAN board, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, and the drive's cage. Carefully snap off the antenna connector from the wireless LAN board. Detach the Phillips No. 1 screw, securing the wireless LAN board in place. The board will pop up. Remove the board from its socket. The wireless LAN board has a notch offset from the center that aligns over a key in its motherboard socket. To replace the wireless LAN board, angle the board into its motherboard socket at a 30-degree angle and press down. Hold it down while replacing the Phillips No. 1 screw. Replace the antenna connector to the board. To remove the VGA port cover if installed in the unit, detach the two Torx 15 screws that secure the cover to the rear of the unit. Pull the cover off of the unit. To replace the VGA port cover, place the cover back against the rear of the chassis over the VGA port, and secure the cover to the rear of the unit with two Torx 15 screws. To remove the motherboard, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, the drive's cage, the M.2 SSD drive if installed in the unit, system memory modules, the wireless LAN board, and the VGA port cover if installed in the unit. Detach all remaining system connectors to the motherboard. Remove the 6 or 7 Torx 15 screws that attach the motherboard to the PC, depending on the motherboard installed in the unit. Slide the motherboard slightly toward the front of the unit and carefully remove it from the unit. If replacing the motherboard in a unit with a push-pin heatsink installed, remove the heatsink assembly and reserve. Place the motherboard in an anti-static bag. To install a new motherboard, first install the reserved push-pin heatsink to the motherboard, if the motherboard has a push-pin type of heatsink. To replace the motherboard into the unit, carefully tip the rear ports of the motherboard into their port cutouts. Clear the connectors away from the edges of the board as you place the motherboard down into the unit. Replace the 6 or 7 Torx 15 screws to secure the motherboard to the unit. Replace all connectors to the motherboard. To remove the heatsink from units with a push-pin type of heatsink, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, the drive's cage, the M.2 SSD drive if installed in the unit, system memory modules, the wireless LAN board, and the VGA port cover if installed in the unit. Remove the motherboard entirely from the unit. Untape the heatsink connector from the motherboard. Detach the heatsink connector from the motherboard. Press on each push pin slightly from the top while using a tool to squeeze each end of the push pin on the bottom of the motherboard to release each of the push pins, securing the heatsink assembly to the motherboard. Remove the heatsink and cooler fan assembly from the motherboard after releasing all the push pins. If you are replacing the heatsink or cooler fan, detach the 4 Phillips No. 2 screws that secure the cooler fan to the heatsink. Remove the cooler fan from the heatsink. To install a new cooler fan or heatsink, place the cooler fan onto the heatsink, aligning the label side of the fan against the heatsink, and the cooler fan connector towards the bottom of the heatsink. Secure the cooler fan to the heatsink with 4 Phillips No. 2 screws. Before replacing the heatsink assembly onto the motherboard, first clean off the old thermal grease from the microprocessor. clean the grease from the heatsink if you are replacing the same heatsink into the system. Apply new thermal grease or a thermal pad to the microprocessor. Align the push pins of the heatsink over the 4 holes on the motherboard. Push each of the push pins down until it pops through the motherboard and is secure. Replace the heatsink connector to the motherboard. Tape the heatsink connector to the motherboard. To remove the heatsink from units with a heatsink secured with screws, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, the drive's cage, and the fan duct. Detach the heatsink connector to the motherboard. Loosen the 4 captured Torx 15 screws for the heatsink. And gently pull the heatsink and cooler fan assembly out of the PC. If you are replacing the heatsink or cooler fan, use a Phillips No. 2 screwdriver with a very slender barrel to detach the 4 Phillips No. 2 screws that secure the cooler fan to the heatsink. Pull the cooler fan off of the heatsink. To install a new cooler fan or heatsink, place the cooler fan onto the heatsink. Use the slender-barreled screwdriver to secure the cooler fan to the heatsink with 4 Phillips No. 2 screws. Before replacing the heatsink assembly into the system, first clean off the old thermal grease from the microprocessor. Clean the grease from the heatsink if you are replacing the same heatsink into the system. Apply new thermal grease or a thermal pad to the microprocessor. Align the 4 screws of the heatsink over the 4 screw holes on the motherboard, with the connector aligned toward the top of the unit. Tighten the 4 Torx 15 heatsink screws. Replace the heatsink connector to the motherboard. To remove the CPU, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, the drive's cage, the fan duct, and the heatsink cooler fan assembly. Press down to release the CPU load lever from its retention tab and pull the load lever and load plate away from the socket. Identify pin 1 on the socket by the mark on the corner of the socket stencil. Line up the pin 1 connector of the Intel CPU removal replacement tool over the socket. Press down on the plunger of the removal tool to pick up the CPU from the socket, and remove the tool and the CPU from the motherboard. To replace the CPU, first identify pin 1 position on the microprocessor by noting the yellow mark on the corner of the chip assembly. Make sure the Intel CPU staging tool side pins are set to the correct socket type for the CPU. For this unit, it is LGA 1151. Place the CPU into the Intel CPU staging tool. When correctly inserted, the small notches on the side of the CPU should align over the side pins on the staging tool. Place the removal replacement tool over the stage, lining up the pin 1 triangles on each tool. Press down on the removal replacement tool to pick up the CPU from the stage. Align the removal replacement tool again to pin 1 on the motherboard CPU socket. Press the plunger on the removal replacement tool to release the CPU into the socket. Swing the load plate down. Lock the load lever under its retaining tab to secure the microprocessor in place. To remove the front wireless LAN antenna in units with a front wireless antenna installed, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, the drive's cage, the fan duct, and the VGA port cover. Carefully remove the motherboard with other components attached. Note that the antenna connector will be detached from the wireless LAN board as part of removing the motherboard. Disengage the wireless LAN antenna cable from the cable guides on the side wall of the chassis. Carefully pry out on the antenna adhesive and remove the antenna from the unit, pulling the antenna cable out through its front access hole. Each antenna has a tab at the bottom that fits behind a cutout on the PC. Each antenna also has a tab at the top that fits into a cutout on the PC. To replace the antenna, feed the antenna cable in through its small access hole at the front of the chassis. Slide the bottom antenna tab behind its cutout, and press the antenna adhesive and top tab into place. Replace the antenna cable into the series of cable guides on the side chassis wall. To remove the single rear wireless LAN antenna in units with a rear antenna installed, first remove the side cover, the optical drive, the front bezel, the drive's cage, the fan duct, and the VGA port cover. Carefully remove the motherboard with other components attached. Note that the antenna connector will be detached from the wireless LAN board as part of removing the motherboard. Disengage the wireless LAN antenna cable from the cable guides on the side wall of the chassis that lead to the rear of the unit. Remove the rear antenna cover by squeezing on the tabs securing it to the rear of the chassis. Carefully pry out on the antenna adhesive and remove the antenna from the unit. Each antenna has a tab at the side that fits behind a cutout on the PC. Each antenna also has a tab on the other side that fits into a cutout on the PC. To replace the antenna, first feed the antenna cable into the main cavity of the unit through its access hole at the rear of the chassis. Slide the antenna tab behind its cutout and press the antenna adhesive and other tab into place. The rear antenna cover has two tabs on one side and one hook on the other that fit over cutouts on the rear of the chassis. To replace the rear antenna cover, press the two tabs into their cutouts and press the hook into place until the cover is secure. Replace the antenna cable into the series of cable guides on the side chassis wall.